turn things over to you, Professor Todd.
Yes, I'm
Yes.
ready to go. I'm just clicking things here.
Okay.
I'm just truly delighted, everyone, to finally get to be with you. As was mentioned, my journeys across Norway in February were interesting. And so my opening slide is a reminder of that wonderful visit um, that I had in Lofoten, and of course the barriers to actually getting there to you in Oslo. But as introduced, I'm looking forward to talking about some of the work that I'm kind of involved in relation to conceptions and practices of safety in our online environments. And my major work, of course, is situated in the school environment. I'm fascinated to hear about what potentially might happen in Norway regarding school libraries. They are, to me, very unique and centrally important places as part of school life and as part of school culture. And so much of my work focuses on kids and their school environment, their learning environment, and so on. Now, I just got to make sure that I can change these slides. I put these pictures up every time I speak to somebody, and what my goal is to talk for maybe 45, 50 minutes. And then at the end of that, we can have some discussion and questions. And I really believe deeply and truly that libraries are part of our lives. They are life. They are sustaining in terms of the information and the energy of coming to know and coming to understand that is so critical, I believe, to our well-being and overall to our life in democratic societies. Many will know that, you can see a set of twins here. I am a twin. My twin brother, who I haven't seen for quite some time now, lives in London. And of course, if you think of the biological nature of twins, going back, am I the copy or am I the paste? I think I was ultimately destined to work in the library and information environment. And as mentioned in the introduction, we really are in a very exciting and challenging information landscape that, we're seeing this dramatic transformation in information access, digital devices, voice activation, haptic technologies, and all of these really are transforming the kind of professional roles that we have in the library and information sector. I think particularly of the COVID-19 challenges that we have faced very strongly here in the US, in terms of the changing nature of engagement with technology for learning and the forces that shape that process. We're looking at dramatic changes in the way that content is published and the ongoing debates, certainly here in the US, in terms of the breakdown of traditional publishing control. This has impacted the way that schools and school libraries here in the US have gone online and access, the critical access to diversity of resources. The changing culture of reading. This again is in many ways strengthened and hopefully encouraging school environments think about the nature of reading and the development of participatory cultures in this visual, linked, interactive environment. And lots of, so what I'm saying is that in many ways, I think perhaps if some good things can come out of this COVID situation, certainly I'd much rather be in Norway than I would be in the US at this point in time. But how is this going to really shape the future of life and living in online environments? And I think that the directions that I heard you speak about in relation to upcoming events in Norway, they just seem to be so rich and interesting. And I love that the profession is talking about these in kind of new and interesting ways. As we think about the journey ahead, as I look at the whole library landscape and school libraries in particular, I keep coming back to the whole arena of reading and literacy development. How do we engage our communities? How do we engage our patrons? How do we engage our students in that process of meaningful inquiry? We have, as one of the dynamics of an online environment, the swirl of misinformation, disinformation, the fake news agenda, and how do we engage our young people in this, in the nature of information inquiry that builds strong and positive life outcomes? How do we engage in what I think is an emerging central role of all kinds of libraries, the development of a thinking community, engaging in critical thinking, problem solving, and the development of intellectual agency. And of course, certainly here in the US, amidst all of this, is the sort of empowerment of self, the whole social justice, civil discourse, community engagement is emerging as a very important and critical topic. And how do we see our libraries, school, public libraries, academic libraries, as central to personal, social, and cultural agency? And of course, as mentioned in the introduction today, what my particular interest in is not just how do we learn in this connected digital culture, but how do we live? And that, of course, has implications for human well-being and safety. And that's the kind of current work, how do we, and just sort of to bring all of this to a point at the, in this presentation, how do we create libraries as part of a diverse information ecosystem, certainly enabled by IT? How do we address questions of the digital divide? How do we empower this information ecosystem regardless of social, economic, and access circumstances? How do we nurture this journey, individual journey of transforming information into deep knowledge and understanding? How do we provide the professional expertise to nurture the notion of libraries as part of this diverse information ecosystem? And I think that has some really important questions in relation to professional education for the library and information community. And there's certainly questions that we're addressing here at Rutgers. But, one of the other dynamics that's increasingly coming out in all of this is how do we create the safe ecosystem where, particularly in schools, students can retreat and work safe in terms of personal identity, safe in terms of a whole social justice agenda, safe in terms of being free of threat because of identity, sexuality, social relations, and so on. These are really critical challenges. And so, you know, my focus has, in the last year or so, focused on school libraries as safe ecosystems. And this is very much a thought journey. I've got some research to share with you. This is, in some ways, COVID has interrupted the research agenda because of, you know, part of my work, it calls for face-to-face access with participants, and the whole arena of safety in an online environment is a pretty fraught agenda. And of course, the university here at Rutgers has placed some pretty stringent requirements in terms of the ethics clearances. So we're slowly moving forward in that agenda, but I do have some of the earlier work to share with you at this stage. So, you know, thinking about school libraries as safe ecosystems, what do they think about? You know, focus, and my work focuses on what do kids think safety is, being safe in an online environment. What do they think, and how do they enact it? What are some of the actions and practices around that? So that provides a kind of broad foundation for the work that I'm doing. I'm going to just briefly touch on some of the current thinking and theorizing around this. You know, I live in an academic environment, so getting my head around what actually is safety and what are some of the sort of theoretical notions around safety, and how does that inform my work. And, you know, it's kind of a really complex area. There's lots of, as you will see, lots of interesting and diverse perspectives. And one of my challenges certainly is to delve into this arena with trying to unravel the whole set of thinkings around safety in online environments, and how then do we develop interventions for moving forward. So that's kind of the broad focus that I'll do today. But just as a kind of a brief overview, here's some of the early literature around this whole topic of kids, youth, young people, well, I tend to call them kids, in online environments. There's, you know, we're seeing children's increasing immersion in online environments. This is nothing new. This has been documented for almost a decade now. You know, I'll talk about Sonia Livingston's work in Europe. The Pew Internet and American Life projects have been going on from 2001. And part of this increasing immersion, of course, is discourses around helping children stay safe. The whole safety agenda kind of emerged in the middle of this decade, and it's a pretty hot topic at this time, at this moment. But what is very interesting is that the agenda around digital safety has actually been led very much by concerned parents, concerned practitioners, teachers, librarians, and much of the concerns have centered over the potential negative impact, the potential negative knowledge, emotional, and social consequences of online interactions. And I put emphasis there on the word potential, and we'll come back to that so the groundswell for this whole emerging set of discourses around safety comes from concerned adults, and the concern is typically framed in terms of potential online risks, web content, or access to problematic content, the problematic around user-generated content, sexual content, sexual messaging, the whole pornography agenda, stranger danger, cyberbullying, personal data misuse. These tend to be these kind of perception of potential threats has provided a kind of urgency and take up by educational authorities all around the world. And of course, there's some also, and I think part of the complexity of this, there is some interesting research and certainly ongoing from the Center, the Crimes Against Children Research Center here in the USA. There's actually, and I think this is probably a good thing, there's some emerging criticism of what educational systems, in fact, are doing in relation to youth internet safety programs, you know, and they're criticizing them that these typically are top down and they have this kind of cloud of harm and danger, and many of the internet safety programs are sort of context in this kind of sense of impending harm and danger, and there's been some negative commentary on that, because in many ways this is also kind of akin to bullying when you couch safety programs in a kind of dramatic bullying kind of way. And of course, so we've got this moral panic over the impact of technology, and you know, part of this you'll see is you know the protection of childhood innocence, and this kind of I would say contextually there's a lot of public anxiety, moral panic driven by a sense of potential fears and dangers. And of course the media contribute to this. You know, you see it in the news every day. Here's one from New Jersey, you know, alleged child predators using social media. Here's another one, an early one from the UK, you know, kids being connected to strangers and the whole stranger danger fear. And this is ongoing, the fact that disturbing content on YouTube. And so you see this dramatic play out of media that kind of exacerbate the sense of potential harm and fear, and creates the moral panic. And typically, at least what you see in the US, is the sort of heavy-handed top-down approach often by educational systems. You know, and I have been a little bit critical of how here in the US about how school libraries respond to this. Of course, here in the US, we have the American Library Association role in professional development. And this tends to be the sort of typical broad response, at least from the library and information associations, is we've got to teach them to be digitally literate. We've got to teach them a whole set of skills, cognitive skills, technical skills, location skills, evaluation skills. And, you know, what you see is almost this kind of top-down, a skills-based approach. And one of the things that I've been doing, and when I come to the end of my presentation, you'll see I've been talking about I'm not convinced that this kind of laundry list of skills that we teach kids is maybe the best way of moving forward. And of course, there's all this competing terminology: information literacy, digital literacy, digital citizens, cyber citizens, this whole digital natives, digital immigrants. Mark Prensky, you know, I find this notion of digital natives and digital immigrants really culturally and historically very offensive. Digital visitors, digital residents. I just am not convinced that these kinds of labels are actually serving any purpose. After all, and I'll mention very briefly in a little while, you know, we kind of have separated our digital lives from our real lives. And after all, they're just part of all of this. And we've created in many respects this kind of mess. We've got hundreds and hundreds of models of information literacy, and they tend to be typically iterations of skills that must be taught. You could sense my kind of despairing at some of this, even though, you know, I've been involved in the information literacy movement for a long time. And we've got this creation of endless digital literacy models as well. And I think this kind of is in many ways an outcome of some of the deep educational concerns, some of the moral panic that might be around all of this. And I actually think, as some of you may be familiar with the work of Professor Renee Hobbs, who runs a very well-funded and very prestigious Center for Digital Media. And I like her work very, very much. I know her reasonably well. And what she says, that as we think about safety in online environments and the whole development of kids' digital capacities, educational responses are typically framed in terms of information and digital literacy, which is simply this long list, a laundry list of skills that need to be taught and often broken down into, you know, at grade 8, this is what you've got to do, grade 9, this is what you've got to do. And she's kind of critical of this checklist of skills, which is an educational response. She's also critical that digital literacy education generally emphasizes the negative effects of media, and that we engage in the teaching of these skills, digital literacy education, to mitigate those negative effects. And she said what happens too is that often a problem is escalated in the media. It presents a kind of public discourse around vulnerability, and that tends to take over. And so there's some important critical questions around what constitutes safety, and often many of the kind of interventions are developed emerge out of often short-term funded grants and so on. So I'm just presenting that her work is really, really interesting in that she's foreshadowing, I think, for the library, the information, the media communities to begin to rethink how we position ourselves in terms of digital safety. Of course, you know, two important pieces of work that have impacted me, the wonderful feminist scholar Donna Haraway, in her work, look, 1985, the Cyborg Manifesto, talks about the breakdown of boundaries between human and machine. And we see this breakdown of dualisms playing out in so many aspects of our daily lives. What is fact and what is fake news? What is right and wrong? What is truth, illusion? What is self and other? What is male and female? And so on. And I love the work, and you might want to take a look at it. It's just now in its second edition. Mary Chayko, her book, Super Connected. Mary Chayko was one of our scholars in our school here at Rutgers. And I think she brings together what has been a really critical element of discourses around our digital lives and digital skills and digital citizens. And, you know, what she says is that we've created this kind of artificial boundaries between what is virtual, what is cyberspace, what is digital. And she says they're misleading in the sense that they imply something almost but not quite real. We've kind of separated this kind of notion of our digital lives, and in the other pocket is our real lives. And she says, you know, digital life is simply real life. And I love that. And I'm really often challenged to get my head around taking away that notion of the separation. You know, what she comes on about is, in all of these developments, what we've got to focus on is the whole question of human agency. And, you know, this is actually playing out in the US with COVID-19 as schools have gone online. I was in a conference just on Saturday, this past Saturday, where I was listening to panels of educators and school principals all talking about, you know, how the COVID-19 has impacted their school environments. And they're all focused on access to technology, access to resources. And I challenge them, because what still seems to be missing is the empowerment of human agency, the dynamics and realities around developing power to engage with information in all of its form, the ability to construct deep knowledge and understanding. Have a look at this. I love this picture because it in many ways illustrates this kind of unity of digital lives and real lives. Here, look at the joy on these kids. It's pretend. And, you know, I just love the lovely sense of childhood here, and that these kids are aware of what's happening in the broader digital environment. I put that link there here as well, because you know, when you go into that link, the discussion centered on, oh, this is a fake image. Is it a fake image? Look at the size of the hand, for example, of the child. And I just think, look, here is just such a joyful, beautiful representation of life for these kids. This is their real world. And, you know, let's just, what we've sometimes forget is just the joy of childhood. And this, what I'm saying is that, you know, thinking about how do we as scholars, how do we as practitioners move and move our thinking. You know, it's not children's online and offline worlds. These are parts of the continuous practices of everyday life. You know, this rejection of Prensky's notion of digital natives, as I've mentioned, they're pretty much, to me, offensive terminologies. You know, how do we deal with this notion of technological determinism, the, everything, the upward, onward march of technology, everything due to technology. And I want us to come back to thinking about the kind of development of human agency. And as I've already mentioned, the public anxiety, the moral panic around all of this. And the challenge of moving beyond these panicky accounts of the dangerous internet based on these small number of cases. And of course, safety is important, but how do we protect our children, and balancing protection against enabling children's rights, pleasures and opportunities, including, the opportunity for risk-taking. And that's something we'll talk about. And I'm sure you're familiar with the notion of children's rights. It's a pretty big movement. If you look at the UNICEF website, you'll see, and of course, the rights of every child also frame the kind of thinking that I think I'm bringing to my research agenda. And, non-discrimination, the best interests of the child, the right to survive and develop, and the views of the child. And thinking about what are the best interests of our children? How do we provide and nurture that ongoing development, and provide opportunity for these kids to build their full potential? And how do we, in fact, engage with the views of the child? And, this raises a critical question. Whose voice do we listen to in this whole public discourse around digital safety? We've actually failed in many respects to listen to the voice of children. And of course, my work is centering very much on child-centered research. This moves away from traditional conceptions of child as having no capacity to think about or to think deeply, not possessing the capabilities and competencies to be involved in research. How do we, and what we're beginning to see slowly in this whole arena of digital safety is in fact a coming back to understanding how kids think about safety, to understand how they respond and live and be in digital environments. And I love this attention that's coming through very much in terms of privileging children's voices. And of course, this has some really interesting and useful impacts in the way we think about and research this whole arena of digital and online safety. And of course, I'm just going to give you some of the research challenges that we face. There's so many terms for a start: internet safety, media safety, online safety, digital safety, cyber safety. And what is really interesting is I've spent many months digging around what this concept of safety is. And there's so many circular and meaningless statements. For example, safety is about trying to be safe. Well, that doesn't tell us anything. What do we actually mean by safety? And of course, again, the problematic of digital safety is exacerbated because of the kind of traditional boundaries around it. It's driven by adults. It is based on thinking that children are not capable of protecting themselves. The other messy thing about all of this is much of the panic and moral panic and indeed educational practices are driven by the notion of potential of risks. There's a focus on risks, and there's almost no research in terms of evidence of harm. And in fact, can you even measure harm? Should you even measure harm? There are a whole lot of ethical aspects around measuring harm, and this whole notion of potential of harm is what has driven very much this agenda discourses around digital safety. And you know, and we see this playing out already now, particularly as some of these potentials for harm are exacerbated by the immersion of kids in online schooling. Who's responsible for empowering and protecting children online? Is it schools? Is it the government? Is it the industry who's providing content and services? Is it family? So let's, you know, I want to dig a little bit more. And you think about, well, what is safety? You know, is safety something you do or part of what you do? You drive safely. Is safe something that you be? I promise to be safe. Is safety something you take? You take safety precautions. Is safety something that you ensure? You ensure the health and safety of others. Is safety a place you go to? The children were taken to safety and so on. So you know, one of the, as I confronted this whole arena of safety as a scholar, I was immersed in a kind of a rather protracted tour through the literature to try and figure out what safety actually is. You know, our educational systems posit safety as a whole list of digital skills, as I've already mentioned. But you know, what is really interesting, and this is where this kind of become a critical eye-opener for me, was, you know, there are a whole host of conceptions of safety, and they're not actually found in the educational literature. They're found in the health and medical and health literature. They're found very much in terms of the car industry, the airline industry, are all, in fact, when you engage in the sort of body of theoretical literature around safety in terms of health and well-being, in terms of the airlines, you begin to see that there's a whole bunch of theoretical perspectives around safety that haven't even necessarily hit the kind of educational discourses. And I found it absolutely fascinating to dig around in this kind of literature that I've never wallowed in before. You know, the airline industry. I love flying. I got a bit stopped when I was in Norway in February, but their approaches to thinking about what safety is and how do you develop practices around safety. And two of the kind of theoretical models that I've looked at, which I think are really important, and these certainly emerge out of the health and wellness arena, and also in terms of the automobile and airline safety arena. Safety is collective mindfulness, and I'll touch on that when we get closer to the end. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this study. This is ongoing. It started some 8 or 9 years ago. This was the very large project led by Sonia Livingston out of the UK, and it was a huge study across countries of the European Union, some 25 European countries, a sample of 25,000 kids, 100 researchers. It involved 25,000 kids, but it also involved one of the parents or caregivers. So it was a huge study that looked at kids and their parents, caregivers in relation to safety in online environments. Again, one of the issues with this research was that it focused on kind of adult-driven, predetermined potential risks, and I've already mentioned these. So it was engaging kids in interviews, face-to-face responses, engaging a parent or a caregiver with a questionnaire to try and tease out some of the impacts or thinking around some of these risks, and the results have been published. Sonia Livingston is doing this ongoing research. As I said, it involved a huge team of scholars across Europe. If you haven't looked at that, dig around into it. There is their website in the link that I've provided there. It's a wonderful, wonderful study, and it was very integral to shaping my own thinking, and some of the findings was what I think is really at a sort of summative level with these findings is that kids see online environments as part of their everyday lives. There are concerns kids have encountered, problematic aspects of being online, but they also demonstrate a certain resilience. They very clearly demonstrate that they are capable of undertaking a range of strategies that help them engage with the problematic scenario online. Some of the things I'll just very, very quickly mention. The kids are willing to share personal data. That came out in some of our studies as well. Kids don't make a distinction between friends and strangers. Many strangers are actually friends of friends. Having a public profile doesn't seem to have any strong impact in making them vulnerable to data misuse. Kids have a mindset of experimenting with self online. As parents, we teach our kids to pretend, and then suddenly when kids go into an online environment, the notion of pretend emerges as a problem. And kids, as they experiment with self in their online environments, is really consistent with some of the developmental theories that adolescents, young kids experiment with their identities and self presentation. And overall, no evidence that experimenting with self was actually that children experienced harm from these kind of online practices. One of the key problems, of course, was cyberbullying, and I think that's really, really critical still. The peak ages you can see there. What is very interesting in this study with cyberbullying, kids who were cyberbullying tend to gravitate towards bullying themselves, and that's I think this is the most complex arena. It's very, very troublesome. But what was really interesting is that certainly kids who were in a cyberbullying situation were upset. Children who experience more psychological difficulties are likely to be victims or perpetrators of cyberbullying. And I think that there is, that emerges to me as one of the central areas in terms of developing kids' resilience and mindfulness of this. You know, in terms of sexting, you know, sending sexual messages, what came out of this study was, oh yeah, look, it happens. And the kids said, look, we drive with our parents and we see billboards, we see signposts that exemplify sort of sexual messaging, and they don't see online as any kind of difference. This is the continuity of online and digital lives. I know I'm rushing through all of this. And, you know, in this sort of the whole arena of pornography, we kind of hold children, hold them up to be innocent, and yet we seem to think that they're engaging in dangerous sexuality and online environments. And of course, any kind of research in relation to digital porn and the links to risks is very tenuous. But what came out in this study is that, you know, while we tend to focus on access to pornography in digital environments, kids see it all around their everyday lives: television, video, film. They see it in signposts, they see it in shopping centres. And while overall so many had encountered such images, some were bothered by it. For some, you know, in some countries, it was actually, some saw it positively in terms of, you know, a form of sex education. You know, I just encourage you to go back and look at the Sonia Livingston work. You know, stranger danger, again, this is what came out of this study with the children and with their parents or caregivers. You know, kids are not out there engaging in stranger danger, in online to offline connections. Most offline meetings are connected to family, friends. What came out in all of this EU stuff is that kids have an actual wealth of knowledge about this. And what also came out in this study is that kids do take action. What I'm going to very briefly, I know my time is winding up and I want to just get to some of the kind of responses. I've been involved in a number of research studies with my librarian colleague from the National Library of Qatar, the beautiful new National Library there, Vijay Medine. And we've done a number of studies looking at trying to begin to tease out kids' conceptions of digital safety and practices surrounding that. And so this first slide was the very first study that we did with 148 kids in grades 5 to 10. It was in one very large international school in the Middle East. And what we wanted to try and do was to begin to tackle how they saw how they saw and what helps they may need in relation to digital literacy and digital safety. And what you see here was the evidence-based action plan that we developed. And when we used a survey instrument from the Open University of the UK to try and understand what their thinking and practices were around their digital competencies. And what emerged out of this was very clearly their concern about personal safety. And certainly this came through in all of the work of Sonia Livingston too, that kids do have concerns about this. They want to be safe. And how do you manage the technical disruptions that often center on digital safety? How do you manage the personal disruptions of, say, for example, encountering some bullying? And so what we actually did was to develop way back then a kind of overall school plan that focused on these 4 dimensions. You can see they're about competency, but what I wanted to just present in the early years of this, that kids were actively thinking about their own safety as they engage in online environments. The second study we did was 425 students in schools in the Philippines. And so these are kind of global studies. And we got kids working in groups to map their conceptions of safety and what they understood as unsafe websites and safety responses in online environments, how they recognized whether a website is safe or not, and what do they do. And again, what I want to bring out here is that this was a bit staggering in a sense that kids have a really deep knowledge of what's going on in the web. This is what astonished me. They have a specific knowledge of the web that I don't even have. Here are kids, grades 5 to 10, for goodness sake, talking about the deep web, torrent, problematic websites. They could even list pornographic websites, But what was very interesting here, and they had a deep awareness of what unsafe websites were, one, sexual and violent content, malware, pop-ups and spam, aware of privacy and security issues and so on. But one of the things that really concerned us here was that they saw the problem very much centering on technical access. They saw the potential for harm, but they saw it rather than a sense of personal harm. They were more concerned about how this might shut down their computer, so there was some really interesting gaps emerging here. And the third study is the ongoing study that we've been working on. This was zeroing in now more recently in their conceptions and practices around digital safety, and we engaged a group of 50 students and 10 school librarians. These are very small, but they help us really begin to unpack what are some of the central issues surrounding all of this. I'll just very quickly whiz through some of this. It was the students were surveyed through an instrument, and the school librarians were surveyed through a structured interview. But what you begin to see here is the total immersion in online lives. You can see here the frequency. I'm not going to necessarily go through it because I'd like to just finish up with some of the kind of recommendations. But kids have a deep immersion in this life. You can see the social media accounts that they're involved in. This was kind of pre the sort of emergence and wave of TikTok involvement. But what you see here is, some kind of, probably only half of the group seem to have a concern for digital safety. I don't know whether that's a concern or not, you know, but at least certainly half of this group seem to express some concern about it. It does appear there. You know, online practices, these are the kind of findings that are pretty much consistent with Sonia Livingston's work. You know, kids do give out a whole lot of stuff about themselves. Some are, certainly to a lesser extent, what they actually share with strangers. As I said before, the Sonia Livingston work, there's sort of this blurry boundary between what is a friend and what is a stranger. In fact, to them, a stranger was a friend, a friend of a friend. Then, you know, is it okay, some of their online identities and practices? You see what was very interesting here is this 70%, is it okay for people to log on as someone younger? Again, that's that manipulation of self-identity, which is a concern for adults, but not so much a concern for young people. What came out in this particular study was sort of, you know, how can you help us? And I think this is a beginning sort of sense of how do we empower these kids without, in a sense, coming down and pounding a set of skills into them? How do we create the help and support environment that teaches them to be mindful, teaches them to be resilient? And how do we support them through our school library and public library in engaging environments? And what you see here is the sort of expression of support around tips and advice, strategies for identifying dangerous sites, strategic use of information searching, you know, strategies, thoughts around online etiquette. How do we recognize online threats? How do we engage in the practicalities of digital safety and so on? And I think this brings me to my kind of final set of ideas. Sorry, I just very briefly touch on in this particular study. You know, what was a little bit sad about this was that the school librarians, and this is a very, very small study, of course, you know, again, was the perception what we've got to do is teach them skills. And for some school librarians, there was some kind of dismissive notion, well, this is not really our concern. This is a broader school. I'm just going to leave that there as I come into some of my final slides. I'm aware that I'm racing and time has gone on. But when we think about educational interventions, we've got to be really careful in not exaggerating the risks or the harm we just don't know. So we've tended, I think, to overscale, exaggerate the dangers rather than kind of taking a more thoughtful approach in terms of how do we, rather than coming down top down, often we tend to punish everybody if there's a happening in the school where there has been some kind of media exposure to some of the online risks. We tend to clamp down on these kids. We tend to work punitively and restrictively. But how do we provide not just within our classes, but to our parents, the positive support and guidance. Certainly coming in all of the stuff I'm reading, how do we avoid these top-down interventionist approaches which tend to be negative and ascribe blame and fear? And I kind of put these akin to bullying. How do we develop active strategies to equip children with the thinking and the mindfulness and the resilience to look after themselves? How do we help them create meaningful profiles? How do we help them build resilience and coping? Because this is what life is all about. When kids are going to be part of their lives as being online, how do we help them empower themselves and to cope and develop that self-efficacy and so on? How do we open up community communications around all of this? And, you know, I'll finish up with a couple of slides here. I'm sorry, my time is running on. But the whole focus, I think, is school-wide, community-wide, library-wide initiatives around coping. When we talk about coping, how do we help kids adapt to the stress and disturbances created by some kind of unwanted intervention or stress in online environments? How do we help build their emotional awareness? How do we help them identify the sort of triggers in their personal lives? How do we help them identify situations that create these unwanted feelings, that create the tension and create the emotions? How do we help them develop, in a sense, a toolbox of coping strategies? How do we help them find what works for them? How do we help them take these kind of scenarios and unwanted situations and develop positive outcomes for them? That's a big agenda. But I think the whole arena around coping, which is a personal life and development agenda rather than a list of skills. How do we help them recognize that there are pathways for help? How do we give them the vocabulary to ask for support? How do we give them the confidence and trust to ask for support from others when they're encountering these kinds of situations online? How do we help them engage in problem solving, maybe engaging kids in thinking through, as part of their instructional environment, scenarios, cases, and examples that engage them in the active development of personal problem solving? How do we teach them to walk away from an online situation? You know, this is all about not just coping, but it's about resilience and helping students, you know, avoid seeing these sort of temporary incursions into their daily life as insurmountable, giving them a sense that they can and have the will and the knowledge and the understanding to address some of these problems. You know, how do we help them develop realistic goals? And how do we help them? You know, resilience is about teaching kids to have a positive view of themselves. Yes, these things are going to happen as I engage in not just my online life, but my everyday life. And how do we teach kids, in a sense, to maintain a hopeful outlook and take care of themselves? That's, I think, so vitally important. And, you know, the whole scenario around mindfulness, this is what came out of the way that large organizations, the healthcare industry, the airline industry, you know, how do you teach kids that this is being mindful of what's going around, think before you link mindset, stop and be aware of your surroundings, think beyond actions to impact, look out for the vulnerable, this whole arena of mindfulness. You know, it's about developing in these kids a culture of thoughtfulness to one another, a culture of well-being, a culture of stopping and thinking, teaching them to stop and think, well, what am I doing in this environment? You know, what am I doing if I'm inclined to want to post this problematic image? Teaching them to pause, stop, and be aware, and begin to think through what's going to happen if I do that. So these are the kinds of strategies that I think of. What I'm saying here is that I think one of the critical answers in terms of schools' responsiveness, libraries' responsiveness, centers around coping, resilience, mindfulness. These are everyday life, living well-being strategies. Anyway, I've talked too long. I really should stop and there. Sorry, I've gone on way too long.